wind howled across the empty prairie as a woman with nothing but a worn carpetbag stumbled along the rutted trail toward an uncertain and terrifying future. Her name was Lillian Hart, and she had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days, her stomach a hollow ache beneath a threadbare and faded woolen shawl. She had been a schoolteacher back in Ohio, a gentle soul who married a dreamer named Thomas and followed him west with promises of a golden life. Typhoid fever had taken Thomas on the banks of the Platte River, leaving her widowed and alone in a harsh land that cared nothing for delicate grief or educated manners. She had sold her wedding ring for a train ticket to Cheyenne, but the station master there had no sympathy for a woman with no references and no prospects. Lillian had walked from ranch to ranch for 2 weeks, offering to cook or clean or teach children, and every door had been shut with suspicion or crude laughter. Now the sun was sinking behind the Wind River Range, and the November cold was seeping through her worn boots with the silent promise of a deadly and unforgiving night. She crested a low ridge and saw a homestead below, a modest cabin with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney like a whispered invitation from a kinder world. Her legs buckled with exhaustion and hunger as she stumbled down the slope, tears freezing on her cheeks because she could not bear another rejection from another hostile and unwelcoming stranger. Jonas Wilder was splitting firewood by the light of a lantern when he heard the soft, desperate cry of a woman collapsing just beyond his sagging corral gate. He dropped the axe and ran, his heart hammering as he found a young woman lying in the dust, her dark hair tangled and her face as pale as the rising winter moon. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms, noting how terrifyingly light she was, and carried her into his warm kitchen with the urgency of a man saving a drowning calf. He placed her gently on a chair by the wood stove, wrapped a thick quilt around her trembling shoulders, and ladled a bowl of venison stew from the simmering pot. Lillian opened her eyes to the scent of rich broth and the sight of a weathered, kind-faced rancher kneeling before her with a bowl of the most beautiful food she had ever seen. Jonas looked into her exhausted eyes and said simply, without any demand or condition, "Come home and eat supper." And those 6 words shattered every wall she had built around her shattered and despairing heart. She ate slowly, her hands shaking, and Jonas sat across the table, watching her with a patience that spoke of his own deep and private acquaintance with profound loss and sorrow. His wife, Martha, had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, taking their unborn son with her, and the silence of the empty cabin had nearly swallowed him whole every single night since. Jonas asked no probing questions that first evening. He simply offered her the spare bedroom, a bar of homemade soap, and the promise that no one would harm her under his roof. Lillian slept for 14 hours, and when she finally awoke to the smell of bacon and coffee, she felt a flicker of safety she had not experienced since Thomas was alive. Over breakfast, she told Jonas her whole sorrowful story, from the cholera outbreak to the slammed doors, and he listened with a quiet intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in months. Jonas proposed a practical arrangement. She would keep the house and help with the garden, and he would provide room, board, and a small wage until she found her footing in this merciless territory. Lillian accepted with grateful tears, and that very afternoon she rolled up her sleeves and began scrubbing the neglected kitchen windows until they sparkled like crystal in the autumn sun. She discovered that Jonas was a good man who had simply forgotten how to live, his clothes mended with clumsy stitches, his meals consisting of scorched beans and bitter coffee, and a profound and aching loneliness. Lillian baked bread that very first week, and the smell of yeast and warmth filled the cabin with a domestic comfort that Jonas had not known since his mother's kitchen in Missouri. She organized his chaotic ledger, discovered that his cattle operation was actually more profitable than he realized, and began writing letters to buyers with a professional script that commanded instant respect. Jonas watched her transform his home with a growing sense of wonder, and he started shaving every morning and putting real care into his appearance. for the first time since his wife's tragic and untimely death. They began to share meals with actual conversation, Lillian describing her love of literature and Jonas explaining the intricate rhythms of the range and the quiet wisdom of working cattle in deep snow. One evening, a neighboring rancher named Coombs came by and made a crude remark about Jonas's live-in housekeeper, and Jonas calmly and firmly escorted the man off his property with a cold warning in his steely eyes. Lillian, who had been trembling inside the cabin, realized in that moment that she trusted Jonas Wilder more completely than she had trusted any human being since her beloved Thomas passed on the trail. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers, and Lillian planted a kitchen garden so bountiful that she began supplying the local mercantile with fresh vegetables and jars of spiced pickles and preserves. Jonas expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a sitting room with a bookshelf he built with his own hands and stained with a mixture of linseed oil and crushed walnut husks from the creek. Lillian filled that bookshelf with volumes she ordered from a catalog in Boston, and she began teaching Jonas to read Shakespeare and the poetry of Wordsworth in the long, quiet evenings by the blazing hearth. He stumbled over the words, his rough fingers tracing the lines, and she would patiently correct him with a gentle touch on his wrist that sent a jolt of electric awareness through them, both each and every single night. The local children began riding over on Saturdays, and Lillian started a small school in the sitting room, teaching arithmetic and geography to the sons and daughters of far-flung homesteaders who hungered for learning. Jonas would lean in the doorway and watch her with a pride so fierce it nearly choked him, her copper hair catching the light as she diagrammed sentences on a slate board with patient and graceful motions. He realized, with a start that nearly knocked the wind from his lungs, that he was no longer simply providing shelter to a destitute widow, but was absolutely and irrevocably in love with the schoolteacher, who smelled of bread and wild roses. The realization terrified him because he had sworn never to risk his heart again after burying Martha beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill. But Lillian's presence was slowly, persistently resurrecting him. One rainy afternoon, a telegram arrived from Ohio, informing Lillian that her father had died and left her a small inheritance that would allow her to return east and live comfortably as an independent woman of means. She stood on the porch with the telegram in her hand, the rain soaking through her dress, and she realized that she had absolutely no desire to leave this dusty homestead or the quiet, honorable rancher who had saved her life without ever asking for anything in return. Jonas saw the telegram and felt a cold dread that she would leave, so he spent the entire day in the barn, avoiding the inevitable conversation because he could not bear to hear her say goodbye to his fragile and newly awakened hopes. That evening, Lillian found him in the hayloft, sat down beside him, and tore the telegram into tiny pieces that fluttered down like confetti, made of a past that no longer held any power over her heart or her future. She took his calloused hand and placed it against her cheek, and she told him that Ohio was a memory, but that he, Jonas Wilder, was her home, her sanctuary, and her heart's most unexpected and precious gift from a merciful God. Jonas wept without shame, great shuddering tears of relief and joy, and he kissed her with a tenderness that tasted of salt and venison stew and all the lonely years that were finally melting away like a winter frost beneath the gentle and persistent spring sun. They were married in the sitting room that doubled as her school, and the children she taught threw handfuls of wildflowers as the preacher pronounced them husband and wife in the eyes of heaven and the Wyoming territory. The homestead that had once been a place of silent grief now echoed with laughter, the lowing of healthy cattle, and the sound of Jonas reading love sonnets aloud to his bride with only the slightest stumbling over the more complicated and archaic words. Lillian never forgot the desperation of that frozen twilight, the feel of dust on her cracked lips, and the voice of a man who had said 6 simple words that became the foundation of her entire magnificent and redeemed existence in the West. She wrote a story about it for a ladies' journal back east, And the tale of the rancher who offered supper to a stranger inspired a wave of charitable acts across the prairie that rippled outward like water in a calm and boundless pond. Jonas would often sit on the porch with his wife, watching their own children chase fireflies through the tall grass, and he would marvel at how a single bowl of stew had purchased a lifetime of unimaginable richness and purpose. He told her once, in the quiet hour between dusk and full dark, that he had been the one who was truly starving, dying of loneliness in a cabin full of ghosts, until she stumbled through his gate and fed him with her indomitable and radiant hope. Lillian would smile, take his hand, and remind him that the frontier was full of hungry people. But the hungriest were not those with empty bellies, but those with empty hearts that yearned for the sustenance of unwavering and unconditional love. Their ranch grew into one of the most prosperous in the territory, not because they were greedy, but because their partnership was built on mutual respect, tireless work, and the unshakable knowledge that they had saved each other from the abyss of despair. Travelers would stop at the Wilder homestead and receive the same welcome Lillian had received: a hot meal, a safe place to rest, and a gentle inquiry about the weight they carried upon their weary and dust-caked shoulders. Jonas never turned away a soul because he remembered the night he had almost lost the greatest treasure of his life by simply failing to look beyond his own grief and into the face of a woman who had nowhere left to go but into his waiting and transformed heart. The story of "come home and eat supper" became a local legend, a phrase that cowboys would use when they found a stray calf or a lost traveler, a shorthand for the boundless and redemptive hospitality that defined the Wilder family name for generations. Lillian gave birth to 4 children, and she taught each of them to read by the age of 4 using the same worn copy of Shakespeare that she had once used to teach their father the music of the English language in the flickering and intimate light of the hearth fire. The eldest son, Thomas Jonas Wilder, grew up to become a territorial judge, and he would always tell the story of his mother's desperate walk and his father's simple, world-changing invitation to any courtroom that needed a lesson in mercy and the radical power of basic human kindness. Decades passed, and the cabin became a sprawling ranch house, but the original kitchen was preserved exactly as it was on the night that Lillian opened her eyes to the smell of stew and the sight of a kneeling stranger with a bowl of salvation in his steady and calloused hands. When Jonas finally passed away at the age of 82, Lillian sat by his side, held his weathered hand, and whispered through her tears, "Come home and eat supper, my love," as he slipped peacefully into the eternal feast that awaited him beyond the veil of this mortal and fleeting life. She joined him 2 years later, and the entire Powder River country turned out for her funeral, each mourner carrying a bowl of stew in tribute to the woman who had turned a simple meal into a symbol of hope for an entire and endlessly grateful frontier community. The Wilder homestead still stands today, a living museum of love and resilience, and the descendants of Jonas and Lillian still welcome strangers with the same words that rebuilt a shattered world from the dust and the bitter cold and the profound and aching hunger of the soul. So the next time you feel that you have nowhere left to go, remember the story of Lillian Hart and listen closely, because there might be a quiet rancher out there offering you a bowl of stew and the promise of a home you never dreamed you would find on this vast and mysterious prairie of existence. Subscribe to Western Tales, official right now, so you never miss another heartwarming and life-affirming story of unexpected love and profound redemption on the untamed American frontier. Tell me in the comments below if you have ever found a home in the kindness of a stranger, and if a simple meal has ever changed the entire trajectory of your precious and unpredictable life. Like this video with all the warmth of a hearth fire if you believe that the greatest treasure on earth is not gold or land, but the open door and the generous heart of a person who sees your hunger and offers you a place at their table. Share this tale with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to stumble through a gate. Accept a bowl of stew and discover that home is not a place on a map, but the steady heartbeat of someone who says, with absolute sincerity, "Come in Sit down and eat your fill.